welcome everybody. My name is Marcus Howard. I'm the Program Leader for the Sustainable Offshore Developments Program in the Blue Economy CRC and facilitating, chairing this webinar on developing offshore wind energy in Australia. First of all, on behalf of the Blue Economy CRC, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all work and on which we are hosting the webinar, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and First Nations peoples that may be attending the webinar. The Blue Economy CRC was established with a 10-year funding program under the Australian Government CRC program in July 2019. We have 44 partners from around the world and within Australia and New Zealand, and its purpose is to perform world-class collaborative research, industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of blue economy through increased offshore sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy production. Today's webinar focuses on a particular area of offshore renewable energy development for Australia, and our research in the Blue Economy CRC has been pioneering in establishing the scope and scale of offshore wind, and for the benefit of future planning. Ongoing work that this is reported in this webinar today has moved on to look at the preconditions for successful development of offshore wind, including social acceptability, law and policy settings, and supply chain operations. The key to this current work is a commitment to a pre-competitive collaborative approach between Blue Economy CRC researchers and industry and government to support increased efficacy, integrity, and good governance for the development of offshore wind. Basically, we're providing research insights from the three core research programs in the wind project, developing offshore wind, and then perspectives and insights from our industry partners from around the world, including our colleagues at SciTech, Alberto from SciTech, and Danielle, Dorothy, from Sintef in Norway. Our first group of speakers are focusing on the research side and include, first of all, will be Dr. Danielle Smith from the University of Queensland, looking at the policy and regulation research that's being undertaken. Danielle will be followed by Hugh Breakey, Senior Research Fellow at Griffith University, whose work with his colleagues is looking at ethics and social acceptability. The third of the research perspectives is Professor Stephen Colquhoun from the Australian Maritime College at the University of Tasmania, looking at offshore wind energy supply chain issues. We will then, after that, we'll move into the industry presentations, but I'll now ask Danielle to begin her presentation. Before I do so, we will have questions and a Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. I ask you to use the Q&A box on your on the Zoom function rather than the chat. Please use the Q&A. That will be very helpful, and I'll facilitate that presentation, the discussion. So over to you, Danielle. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Danielle Smith. I'm postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland. I have 15 years experience working as a marine scientist, conducting environmental impact assessments for offshore wind farm projects within Europe, offshore oil and gas industry projects in Australia, and more recently, looking at pre-feasibility and risk assessment studies for offshore wind energy project within the Bass Straits. I have a PhD in international ocean law and governance, and I'm hoping that I will utilize my legal knowledge and apply a practical implementation based on my working knowledge in the marine environment and my understanding of the current gaps, issues, and challenges. So I joined the project halfway through, and therefore I'm going to briefly summarize the findings of my predecessor, Dr. Miguel Froelich, and then I'll go over the stage 2 of this project and the potential outputs. So the aim of work package 1 is to review the legal and policy frameworks governing the offshore wind energy sector in overseas jurisdictions and identify best practices that could be used to inform and improve the offshore wind energy assessment and approval pathways for the growing offshore wind energy infrastructure in Australia. So there is the strategic value of this project, and we have identified through looking at international best practice 3 streams: the marine spatial planning during from the initial prior identification of declared areas, and then throughout the offshore wind energy development, and then the leasing and permitting processes. So it is international best practice to conduct marine spatial planning prior to or during the lease award process to enable the consideration of potential environmental risks, ensure all relevant stakeholders are consulted, and to take into consideration the cumulative impacts of existing and future proposed developments. Leading European countries in offshore wind have MSP frameworks in place to provide input to decisions about leasing of offshore areas and to streamline the environmental permitting process. Leading countries include the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. In Australia, there is no clear marine spatial planning policy specifically adapted to incorporate offshore wind energy planning, and so there is a need to ensure offshore wind energy projects are coordinated as part of an overarching marine spatial planning approach. There is also a need for national and regional marine spatial planning as part of the area identification process and regulatory approval process. On a state level, Victoria is in the initial phase of implementing an MSP framework. However, the geographical scope is limited to state jurisdiction, i.e. up to 3 nautical miles. And obviously, offshore wind energy projects cover offshore as well as inshore and also onshore infrastructure. The Federal Sustainable Ocean Plan that's due to be issued for 2023 to 2025 is the collaborative framework to transition to a sustainable ocean economy. And I'm hoping that this might provide an opportunity to incorporate marine spatial planning into the offshore wind energy planning process. And that's one of the stage 2 of this project's potential outputs. Oops, back. So this is just a screenshot of the cumulative impact assessments for a potential project within the Bass Straits. It just highlights the need to consider cumulative impacts from multiple use projects. So we've got marine national park zones, Ramsar wetlands, major ports, shipping lanes, petroleum platform, wells and pipelines, offshore wind declared areas and licenses that have been approved, submarine telecommunication cables. Not included on here are all the fisheries layers. It's a bit too complicated. Then there's proposed developments to take into consideration in the future, such as the Marinus link cable, and many, many others that I haven't thought of. So in the Netherlands, since 2016, there has been implemented a Dutch framework for assessing ecological and cumulative effects to inform the future MSP of offshore wind energy projects, and also a long-term program to map and monitor cumulative impacts. I think this is something that we could consider in Australia. Now I'm going to talk about the leasing process. An international best practice for granted leases for offshore wind energy projects has not yet emerged. However, According to the World Bank Report 2021, there are formats, and it generally falls into three formats. A bilateral agreement where developers determine the site and apply for a lease and are awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. This can be used for small projects, innovative projects under 100 megawatts, as is in the UK. Then there's the standalone competitive bidding process where the leasing body decides the area to be leased, preferably using MSP principles. And then a competitive bidding process ensues, and that is used in the UK and the US. And a competitive bidding process combined with revenue support, where the leasing body carries out early stage project development work, and then the competitive bidding process ensues, and that's used in Denmark and Germany. This is the leasing pathway within Australia. The Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act 2021 has established a hybrid model where the leasing body has declared areas suitable for offshore wind energy, where the developers may apply for a lease within a declared area, but competition may arise if there are overlapping projects with equal merits that cannot be resolved. And the developers generally bear the burden of the costs and the execution of the site investigations and the environmental assessments. And there is no revenue support that is tied to the leasing framework. Leasing is the first stage on an offshore wind energy project's journey to operation, and therefore pre-planning and offshore wind energy target setting prior to opening up lease rounds is considered best practice. For example, if a market seeks eventual installation of an average of 1 gigawatts per year, then an average of at least 1.25 gigawatts of projects needs to be leased 8 to 10 years prior. Australia doesn't have a national target specifically for generation of offshore wind energy, and this is something that could be improved upon. However, on a state level, Victoria has a target of at least 2 gigawatts for offshore wind energy generation by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, and 9 gigawatts by 2040. 6 licenses have been granted and a further 6 being considered. These 12 projects could generate 25 gigawatts of electricity, which is enough to power Gippsland 100 times over.
Danielle, could we start wrapping up, please?
Yep. So international best practice for environmental permitting, there's generally 3 models: centralized model, a decentralized model, and a hybrid model. I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm going to go to the next slide where I talk about the environmental permitting process in Australia. An environmental assessment is triggered if a matter of national environmental significance is impacted under the EPBC Act 1999, regulated by DQ. However, under the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act, there is no direct requirement for an environmental assessment, but a management plan is required as part of the feasibility and construction license. And that's regulated by NOPSEMA. Next slide. So recently I submitted some recommendations on the consultation on the offshore electricity industry amendment regulation this year, where I recommended that firstly, an environment plan be, the draft regulation should be redrafted to provide for an environment plan to be included. And secondly, to include stakeholder engagement strategy. The environment plan and stakeholder engagement strategy can then form the basis and be included within the management plan to avoid duplication of information and to enable the regulator to manage the environmental conditions stipulated by DQ under the EPBC Act. Alternatively, draft a separate regulation providing for the potential environmental impacts resulting from the industry activities that could be compiled similarly, as is with the case for the offshore petroleum and greenhouse gas storage environment regulations. Next slide. So I'm just going to skip through these case studies. I've run out of time, but it will be available online if you would like to look more into it. Lastly, stage 2 of the project, these are the aims and the outputs which I will be looking at. So I will be reviewing international best practice and tools for implementing marine spatial planning and stakeholder engagement processes in Australia prior to establishing declared areas and throughout the offshore wind energy development process. To identify international best practices for undertaking cumulative impact assessments on a project-specific, regional and national level, as well as to provide input in considering cumulative impacts in the MSP process and regulatory framework. to recommend best practices for data sharing systems and the regulatory requirements, and to provide guidance on compiling and implementing management plans, including environmental impact assessments, environmental plans, and stakeholder engagement strategies. And also, in line with this, develop a checklist and/or a risk matrix that can be easily used for industry proponents in navigating the complex policy and regulatory processes. So my aim is to act as a conduit between the government, industry, and stakeholders. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Danielle. That's great. That's excellent. I'll now call on Hugh Breakey to move into the next phase. Thanks, Hugh.
Terrific. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Danielle. So I'm going to be talking today about some of the ethics and social acceptability issues that arise in offshore wind. And this is work that I've done at Griffith University's Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law alongside my colleagues, Laurel Bossy and Professor Samford. Can we go to the next slide, please? Unless I've got control. Oh, maybe I've got control. Thank you. So social acceptance in offshore wind. And so some of this is relatively straightforward. Many common sense ethical values are going to apply to offshore wind developments, the same as they would do to any other blue economy development, the same as they would do to many other types of developments that we would be considering in Australia. And so along the right-hand side of your screen in that little text box there, I've got a little laundry list of the types of values that we've found that come up in the literature, and they are largely unsurprising. You will see things like environmental sustainability, stakeholder participation, fairness, which can include procedural fairness, but also the distribution of goods and risks and burdens, harm prevention, beneficence, which is just doing good, making sure that you're producing stuff that is good for human beings, and things like integrity, being trustworthy. And so they're the sort of things that we would expect any development to do. And we might have higher expectations for offshore wind, perhaps for a couple of reasons. One is because the main reason for doing it, or at least one of the central reasons for doing it, is just a justice-based concern, is a concern for making sure that we can contribute to carbon mitigation efforts by developing renewable energy, along with many other international partners. And that's a good thing to do. And because we're in the business of doing this, because it's a good thing to do, it makes sense that we might be held to high standards. And we also might hope that if mistakes have been made previously on land, maybe we've learned a bit. Maybe we'll get a little bit better when we're moving offshore into the blue realm. Now, even though those ethical principles I've sort of got on the screen there, many of them will seem straightforward, but of course the way they can play out can be complex. And we don't have to go far to find an example of that. That very top value that we've got there, environmental sustainability, that might play out in very different ways when we're considering something like wind energy. And what we find is that in this context, in Australia, but also around the world, widespread endorsement, community endorsement of renewables doesn't automatically translate to local acceptance. When something like this happens, it's easy to think, okay, this is NIMBYism, right? If people don't like jails and sewage plants next to them, but they think that they have to be there somewhere, then often the suspicion is the person wants it, just not in their backyard. But things are a little more complex here, and it's important, I think, not to assume that what's going on here is any type of straightforward NIMBYism. The reality is that we do just find within that value of environmental sustainability genuine green on green conflicts where we have good green environmental reasons for wanting to mitigate carbon, and we have good green environmental reasons for being worried about impacts on, for example, local ecologies or local sea life, etc. And so we're going to have to work out ways of proceeding in ways that are going to be getting us the best outcome on both of those two concerns, especially if they might come into conflict. And of course, if they do come into conflict, and we've certainly seen this play out overseas, and perhaps we're seeing it play out in Australia, there is a risk of politicization. And no doubt some level of political discussion is really, really important here, because communities and people need to have their say, and we're a democracy, and that's the arena we would want these things to play out in. But at the same time, because if you're building an industry that's going to need to have a lot of surety over time, vulnerability to changes from election cycles can be a sort of worrying issue. Now, as well as those sort of straightforward ethical principles, those first 6 there, I think many of us would be pretty familiar with. It's worth drawing your attention to that final one there, place attachment. And this concerns sort of the local understandings and knowledges that people have of their shared environment and their place in it. And sometimes that can tie in complex ways with their aesthetic valuing of the landscape around them. And it's important to understand that this is pretty important stuff to many people. Sometimes the way people attach to the place, to their home, to the place where they go on holiday. We're coastal people. We care about the ocean. And that can be very important to people's well-being. It can also impact on people's mental health, the freedom and excitement that many of us find in that unspoiled horizon of the seascape is something that's important to people. And it's important for us to make sure that we're taking concerns seriously when people are sort of raising issues that we need to factor into our consideration. So let me move to next scene. I think I did 2. Right, ethical practice. Okay, so community engagement is critical, and it's important to understand this isn't a one-way process of relaying information. Communities need to be genuinely heard on their values and concerns. And they need to be able to contribute in some ways to decision making. If it's just a done deal, then the community isn't going to feel like they're in control of what's going on. This isn't easy. One reason it isn't easy is because the layered process of making decisions across government agencies, as Danielle already touched on, you've got federal, you've got state, you've got local government who will all have to be involved in various aspects of an offshore wind development. And then you have the industry and commercial operators themselves. All of them can be doing community engagement, but it can be really important to try and develop an overall plan that everyone can see and understand that ensures that the community consultation that's occurring is appropriate to the decision being made at that point, and that if decisions are going to be made at a later point, then the community knows when they will have their turn to have a say about impacts on them and their businesses, for example, impacts on the activities they may be undertaking, and other concerns that they may have. And of course, all this is doubly true when it comes to First Nation people. And then we're going to talk about something like the cultural license to operate. I won't touch on that too much today, but the BE CRC has some terrific resources you can find online on that one. Let me just find my next slide. Right, so just a couple of challenges I'm just gonna finish with. So we do see community benefit schemes arising in this context, and the idea here is that operators or the government in concert with operators will give back to locals, perhaps in the form of funds or perhaps in the form of in-kind contributions to local government, to local organisations, community organisations, and so forth. These can be valuable. They can help with things like fairness and compensation for impacts. But at the same time, they need to be done very carefully. There's a very real concern sometimes raised with bribery. And it is possible to do these things in ways that don't exert an inappropriate influence on civic decision making. But it does take a little bit of planning to make sure that you get that right. So it can look like you're doing the right thing, but it can wind up causing more problems than might be anticipated. And finally, I'll just stress the importance of navigating trust challenges. We all know, I think, that community trust in many institutions is at a low ebb right now. Government, universities and researchers like myself, commercial operators, media itself, all of these can have very limited amounts of trust, and it means that proceeding with the most integrity that we can is really crucial. Governments have a particularly difficult line here because they have a role as a policy driver, but they also have a role as the regulator and the cop in the beat. And that can be a tricky line to walk. And it can be very important that the community can have faith in them operating in both of those roles at once. And in general, we need to really concentrate on how research can be done and be funded and be governed in ways that give those stakeholders reason to trust the information they've been given about the benefits, risks, and impacts, so we can bring that community along with us when we're moving forward with an offshore wind development. Right, I think I'm out of time, so yeah. I will hand over now, and happy to field questions in a bit.
Thanks, Hugh. We'll now go to Stephen Cahoon to talk about supply chain issues. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Marcus. Sorry, I don't seem to have control at the moment. Oh, here we go. Great. So I'm Stephen Cahoon. Thanks, Marcus. I'm the co-lead of this supply chains work package, along with my colleagues, Associate Professor Peggy Chen, and also our postdoc Hongjin Fan. So the supply chain aspects is a critical aspect of making sure that the offshore wind industry is going to be successful. And so part of this is us looking at the capabilities and capacities that's required. So to guide what we are doing, so our major objective is to create a robust, resilient and sustainable supply chain for the offshore wind industry. And along the way, we've got 4 different steps. So the 2 shaded ones, stage 1 and 2, are the ones that we've already completed. And we're now working on stage 3, which is analysing the capabilities, but also the capacities of the Australian offshore wind supply chains. So I'm going to take you through some of the activities that we've already completed to set up what we're doing in this second stage of the project. So the very complex diagram to the right-hand side is our attempts at understanding the offshore wind life cycle. And in doing this here, we used a lot of the literature review and also talking to industry to start to validate. Don't worry, you don't need to read all that. I'm just going to show you just one aspect of this in the next slide for the purpose of this presentation. So as you'll see here in the centre, that's where we've indicated what the current targets are, noting that in the light blue colour there that the federal government doesn't have a target at the moment, and only Victoria appears to have a target. So we've been working with a number of assumptions, and I'll come back to those assumptions very shortly. The next circle is the different stages. So the development and planning, procurement and manufacturing, installation, operations and maintenance, and decommissioning. And just as an example here in the installation area, we've looked at activities, and a couple you can't see there are the logistics aspects of it, the seaports, vessels. We're also looking at how we start to commission, and also what we're looking at is what are some of the targets, what are some of the requirements, and the days that installation will take. In some of the areas, in some of the other areas, we've also started to indicate which type of organisations might be able to be involved as manufacturers. So that's helped us to then understand the supply chain a bit better. And the reason that we're wanting to understand the supply chain is then to start to model it. So it's actually quite exciting to be at the birth of an industry. And what we've done is to develop this model, and the purpose of the model really is to understand if the current targets are feasible, what sort of capabilities we're going to require, what sort of availabilities of things such as vessels and different equipment, and also to see in terms of the longer term planning, and remembering that we're trying to do this to also enable some pre-planning to occur. So in our model, we divided the current areas around Australia up into 3 different clusters. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. With our targets, because we don't have clear targets at the moment, we've divided them up into low, medium, and high targets. We've looked at things such as weather windows to understand what are the operational requirements of installation. So, for example, on the west coast of Australia, it's around about 6 months a year compared to above Bass Strait. Installation could be done 12 months. We've looked at water depth, so we can understand whether or not the fixed bottom or floating, and the various variations may be applicable. And this is where we're also speaking to our industry colleagues about what sort of percentages in terms of those different types of wind turbines. We've also indicated in here what size in terms of the megawatt of each of these turbines, knowing that there are new sizes coming out into the market in different time slots. And you'll see here also substations, the wind turbine spacing, what type of vessels, and of course, how many jobs will be available. And we're doing that per gigawatt. That's the part of it. The second part is also looking at the supply chain demand for all the various aspects of it, noting that some areas such as cables, some estimates at the moment are saying there's a 5-year wait. And within that, we know that there's going to be supply issues. And also too, in terms of whether or not the ports have got enough capacities. So in understanding the installation operations and maintenance, we know there's a whole range of different products or components that are needed. We know there's the workforce that needs to be trained and ready, and there's a whole range of different vessels that's going to be required if we're going to get this industry up in time and ready to meet some of the targets. So that's just a very quick look through that methodology. So here's the clusters I was referring to. So we've divided up these different zones into three different clusters, and we've decided on these 3 clusters really based on they've got some very similar weather patterns and similar depths in there. So I'm going to show you just an example of how this model that I was showing you can be used. So here in the top, we've chosen cluster 2 just for the purpose of the example. On the far right hand side here, you can see the different weather depth, the water depths that we've used. We've used the current targets. So for Victoria, we're able to use their current targets. For Tasmania, we're actually been using the proponents or the proponents' targets because the government doesn't actually have direct targets. And you'll see how they grow up into 2040. There were a range of estimates indicating that installations may start in 2028, but I think they seem to be being pushed out a bit into the 2030s or so.
Stephen, can you start wrapping up, please?
Of course, yes. And we've also indicated what size megawatts can be used, and therefore what sort of percentages in these various wind turbines. And here you'll see for 2030, 2035, and 2040, what we estimate in terms of number of wind turbines and the various vessels and so on that's used, and importantly, the number of construction jobs and operations and maintenance. So really, when we put this together, we know that we also have to take into account the other work packages that's in this project. So we know that using the Swiss cheese model of risk, that there are certain parts where delays may occur, and there's quite a few there that may impact on the various targets. So our next stage, sorry, I'll just go back to this. I'll only take a minute. So our next steps is to validate our data and assumptions. So we're currently conducting a range of interviews, and we'll also be sending out a survey to get these figures, the data validated to make the model as accurate as possible. And our next step is to refine the supply chain evaluation model, the one that I was showing you, evaluate the supply and demand with a bit more accuracy, and then to get into the capabilities and capacities. And then from that, we'll develop a range of scenarios that hopefully will be of assistance to policymakers and also developers. And down the bottom, you can just see some attempts at putting together the supply chain. And I will leave it with that. But if anyone wants to be involved in our surveys or interviews, please reach out to me. We'd love to hear from you to help to improve our model. Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, Stephen. And for the presenters, if you could just look at the Q&A boxes as they're going through. There are a couple specifically referring to presentations given by colleagues. I thank you for the research leads for their presentation. I now call on Anna Lewis. Environment Director of NextSphere, one of our industry partners, to give us perspective on challenges and ambitions and opportunities. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon from Fremantle in Western Australia. I would say sunny Fremantle because it's often sunny, but it's pouring with rain here today. So today I'm the Environment Director at NextSphere. Today I'm going to talk about the ambitions, challenges and opportunities for Australia's offshore wind industry. Okay, so NextSphere and we were founded in 2017. We're an Australian-owned company. Our current focus is the Bass Offshore Wind Energy Project in partnership with Equinor. And we have been a third-party participant with the Blue Economy CRC now since 2022 with both Marine Spatial Planning Project as well as this Preconditions to Offshore Wind projects. Now, what I'm going to focus on today is some high-level industry ambitions around collaboration, shared knowledges, best practice community engagement, innovation, and timely and positive FID, which is final investment decisions, and also look at some challenges and opportunities relating to these. Now, as we've just heard from our other speakers, there are some challenges across the Australian offshore wind industry around policy regulation, social acceptability and supply chains, which are the three different work packages being addressed as part of this project. I did want to discuss more on a positive note, some ambitions. I did want to note that this was a very qualitative process. This is not written down anywhere, but more through discussions with colleagues that have come up time and time again through presentations and discussions that I've sort of derived these ambitions from. So the first one, of course, is collaboration. So collaboration across institutions as well as industry proponents. And this is in consideration of limited resources Australia-wide and to reduce cost. There are some challenges associated with this. Of course, if we don't collaborate, there are limited resources around increased competition for research permits, subject matter experts, stakeholder and survey fatigue. And at the moment, there is a competitive environment among proponents, so it can be challenging. However, the Blue Economy's research agenda has been helpful in addressing this challenge, both through, I guess, the work streams collaborating with industry and with government. And particularly, for example, in Work Package 2 Social Licence, we have been working directly with them to inform sort of, I guess, where their project outputs could potentially meet milestones that are of interest to all industry proponents across the OEI Act, as Danielle mentioned, as well as the EPBC Act to, I guess, inform best practice collaboration across the industry. There's a lot of other great examples of collaboration in the industry as well. Can't really touch on them all, of course, but Women in Offshore Wind, which is a great example, which Erin Coldham's one of the founders who will be speaking next. The CEC, or the Clean Energy Council, have been doing some great work. And there's also some new university collaborations coming up as well. So collaborations are occurring. Apologies, it's just a little bit tricky. The next one is around collective knowledge. So we do have a challenge around locally relevant, publicly available data across these many industry relevant areas. Biophysical, stakeholder engagement, logistics and supply chain. As proponents, we're trying to seek out this knowledge, but there isn't a lot of data publicly available. So we believe that knowledge is power, especially around planning, but we do feel that quality in is quality out, as a lot of researchers would say. So the best quality knowledge that we have available to the industry across all of these different aspects means that the quality that we'll get out of them in terms of industry milestones and outputs will be achieved. And again, the Blue Economy CRC's research agenda can really help with these. There's some great examples from across the work packages. And in addition to that, there's some really good examples from the government as well. National Environmental Science Program, IMOS, Integrated Marine Observing Program, as well as DQ and NOPSEMA have released some excellent guidelines. So I do feel there is some excellent knowledge sharing going on, and more is always better. Another ambition, which Hugh touched on, is around strong reciprocal relationships between the project communities and other interested parties through best practice engagement. And we have met some stumbling blocks to date on this, unfortunately. As Hugh mentioned, there are some great research that's coming out of his stream and through other different research going on across Australia. And what will be supplied, for example, are some recommendations through their project, as well as a detailed guidebook on ethical best practice for offshore wind developments, which will be very helpful. And some other great resources, as Hugh mentioned, is the Cultural License to Operate report from the Blue Economy CRC and the Blue Futures Translational Research Initiative from University of Wollongong are also doing some excellent work in this space. Okay, another one I wanted to touch on, another ambition, is innovation and forward-thinking approaches to secure Australian competitive advantage. Now, the challenge we have for proponents, of course, is time and resources to innovate across the longer term, more involved research projects over 3 years. And there's also challenges, of course, in that there's different proponents are at different stages in their development. So some proponents have been awarded licenses and have a fair bit of certainty, whereas many have not yet been awarded licenses or awaiting zones to be declared. So during this time, as part of this project, for the planning aspect, I guess, of the offshore wind, this really is a great opportunity for the Blue Economy CRC to get into a bit of a deep dive in terms of their research topics to identify global best practice for their different outputs. For example, as we just heard, the logistics and supply chain stream, and there's also some other amazing things the Blue Economy CRC are doing around, for example, floating offshore wind demonstration projects. There's many PhDs coming out of the Blue Economy CRC programs that have incredible multidisciplinary focus projects, and so that's just fantastic to see as well towards innovation. So as we sort of wrap up towards the end here, the other one, of course, on the minds of industry is a timely and positive final investment decision, which is a FID, which is kind of towards the end of that feasibility license period at the end of the 7 years, just before a commercial license is awarded, on whether the investors want to continue with the project or not. And of course, this relates to all these things that are being spoken about in this talk. And so all these items around policy regulation, social acceptability and supply chains are all very relevant to FID. And so what we will see, Martin Farley will talk shortly about work package 4, which is actually a work package that synthesizes these other 3 work packages that we've just heard from to developing a contribution map and also mapping delivery pathways to support the offshore wind industry. And so what we really encourage is an ongoing dialogue between these projects and industry to align their outputs and their timing to the milestones and to the requirements of all the offshore wind proponents that will be required along this regulatory timeline for the next 7 years across this feasibility license period to ensure that we really get some great outputs, or for us, inputs into these milestones to have some very good quality product so that we can really do best practice moving forward as an industry. I also wanted to mention for anyone out there that's non-Blue Economy CRC projects, there's some great MOUs being conducted between industry and universities. And also a really good part of that is talking between each other, between industry and universities around milestones and timing of university publishing versus milestones for industry so that we can align on timing timeframes. And of course, this is great for researchers because you get more impact for your projects, the more sort of uses that we can find for this excellent knowledge that's being generated. So this is the final slide. I just wanted to summarise that the Blue Economy CRC research agenda does provide some excellent opportunities to contribute to high-level industry ambitions around collaboration, shared knowledges, best practice community engagement, innovation, and also to contribute to the timely and positive FID, final investment decision. And this is really good for both industry as well as researchers to collaborate, to have better impact for researchers and better quality outputs and milestones for industry. And a lot of this just comes down to communication. So I just really encourage any researchers to reach out directly, perhaps on LinkedIn or to email to any industry that you feel is relevant to inform your studies or vice versa. And of course, we're reaching out to universities a lot, and it's just really good to have this collaboration. So lots of communication, lots of dialogue moving forward. Thanks so much. Here's my email if anyone wants to reach out, and thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for reminding us of the importance of collaboration and joint ambition and things. So now move on to Southerly 10 and Erin Coldham, the Chief Development Officer at Southerly 10, on her perspective, or their perspective on the wind industry. Thanks, Erin. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Marcus. Hello, all. I'm delighted to be joining you from Wurundjeri country here today in beautiful Melbourne. So for those who I've not met, my name is Erin Coldham. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Southerly 10. Just to explain Southerly 10, you might have heard of us in the past as Star of the South. So that is our first project. And if I can take control of the slides here, I might just flick through. There we go. So Southerly 10, we've got 2 offshore wind projects in the Gippsland area that were recently awarded licenses. As I mentioned, Star of the South, where we have been progressing since our investors, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, entered the market in 2017 here in Australia. And we've done a lot of work under a previous exploration license to confirm the feasibility of the project, the suitability of the seabed conditions, and we're looking forward to taking that project forward to meet the 2 gigawatt target by 2032. Our second project, Cootwood-Bratualang, you can see there a little bit further out, really is a fantastic site named by the Gunai-Kurnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation, and we're very grateful and humbled that they felt suitable to name that project with us at a much earlier stage, so targeting towards the later targets that we have here in Victoria. Okay, still just having trouble with this. I'm not sure if I've got control of the slides, so maybe if someone can override them, I might just get them to flick to the next one. Great, thank you. So the 3 topics I wanted to touch on very briefly during the time that I've got is the themes that we've been talking about here today, the themes of the preconditions for offshore wind in Australia research program. So starting on the sort of regulatory landscape, there's been a bit of detail discussed. I think it's always good to focus on where we've been, where we're going, and where we actually need to go. So where are we at the moment, and what's next? And I think it is really important to acknowledge the progress that we have made. As I mentioned, the last 6 years I've been working in offshore wind. We've gone from not having an offshore wind industry or much belief that one would exist here in Australia, and in a relatively short period of time, bringing in new legislation, new regulations, also Victorian government policy targets, 4 implementation statements. It's actually quite a lot of work if you go back and reflect, and as has been touched on, 12 licenses in the Gippsland area. I think we've been really encouraged by the government's enthusiasm for offshore wind. Star of the South was granted major project status. Again, that's really designed to help coordinate government in assessing the project, recognising the importance that projects like this have towards our net zero economy future that we're targeting for. So looking back at those things, I think that they're very positive. Now we still have some challenges, and that's where I'm really encouraged around since we've had the licenses awarded on the 1st of May of this year, really strong alignment between those 12 license holders, 10 different companies, 12 licenses. There's been some early discussions around what does appropriate collaboration look like, noting that there are future competitive processes. What are the topics that we can actually look at from an industry-wide perspective, from a Gippsland perspective, and what are the pathways forward? And that's also really helpful when we are seeking as developers to align with other stakeholders, whether they be within government and government seeking views in particular on that area for offshore wind development, or anyone with an interest. And some of the key issues that we've picked up through those discussions that are sort of the next ones to discuss, if you will, are the supporting infrastructure. So what are the transmissions and the ports that we need for offshore wind in Gippsland? How are those things coming along? What's the timing and sequencing with projects being able to take final investment decisions? And most importantly, which has already been touched on in this webinar, is community and stakeholder engagement. I mean, that is absolutely critical, and I'll speak more about that briefly, but certainly I've been encouraged by developers all really recognising the potential for consultation fatigue. I think after the licenses were awarded, we thought if everyone goes and does their road shows, that's about 100 sessions for Gippslanders over a few weeks. That's not going to be palatable. So let's band together and host and meet the developer sessions. And we've got those planned over the next few months, which I think is a really good positive move forward, rather than everybody doing their own thing or going their own way in some respects. Equally with other really important topics, the fishing sector, and I noticed Simon Bogue, you're here on the call, and I noticed your question. That is an absolute area where certainly, yes, regulation might play a role, governments might play a role, but I think as industry, we need to have a mature discussion around what are our principles in how we coexist. Coexistence is a principle of the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act. How do we as industry interpret that, and how do we work with others to ensure coexistence, whether that be looking at our projects, looking at the way that we conduct ourselves, and ultimately how we're recognising those impacts and potentially dealing with the consequences of those as we go. So that's just some of the things. And my key message on this topic is really, I think whether we're in industry, government, when it comes to regulations and how we take this industry forward, we need to have the courage to be imperfect. I think we're always going to have access to imperfect information, whether it's developers not understanding when exactly they're going to be able to get vessels and supply chain issues, whether it be governments not being quite clear on what the typical impacts might be from an offshore wind farm and the effectiveness of mitigations. We know that this has been done around the world, but this is the first time we're doing it in Australia. We'll always have imperfect information. So I think being able to move forward in a way that certainly is not reckless, but recognises the broader imperative of needing to get it right, and also forgiving ourselves if we need to go back and fix something up. And I think this is whether it comes to regulations or having the opportunity to understand that something works or not. As Anna said, collaboration and communication is really key in unblocking some of those things. So that's something that I think we need to, as a whole industry, be really mindful of as we go through. Okay, might go to the next slide. I don't know if someone's controlling them, or I'll just try clicking here. There we go. So building trust and support and awareness. And I think Hugh spoke about this. I think a measure of success for our industry is if we can not have to use the term social license anymore. I always struggle with that term because I spend a lot of time in regional communities and no one's using these terms social license. It's a very sort of corporate way to talk about how we work with local communities. But really what it comes down to is just building relationships, awareness, trust and support for what we're doing. I noticed Richard Finlay-Jones, you're also on the call and made the comment around misinformation and disinformation. I think the most powerful thing we can do as an industry is get in early so that some of these areas are inoculated or shielded, if you will, when some of that misinformation or deliberately spread disinformation starts to fly. And we've seen that in Gippsland, where I think communities have had access to information over a very long period of time, over the past 5-6 years. We do see some self-moderation. In fact, some of the social media groups I'm in, on the day that licenses were announced, I could see people getting very concerned in one part of sort of South Gippsland about this particular impact, whereas others were chiming in and saying, actually, it's completely the other side of Wilson's Promontory. You're not going to see it, and we need these projects. So people having that base level of information, but as Hugh also said, it's not one way. So we need to be looking at how we're involving local communities, and certainly we've used things like community advisory groups where we have members, and I think some members are on the call today actually, sharing proactively with us what their communities are talking about, what information they would like. We have members of that group who actually participate in some of our community engagement activities on a volunteer basis to make sure there's that good two-way flow of information. So I think holding ourselves to a high standard is particularly important as we move through with our projects. And just going on to my final slide now, as my time starts to expire. Whoops, I've gone backwards. There must be a secret button here. Sorry for my lack of technical skills. Oh. No, I've gone way too far. Someone's helping me out there. So really, it's just about If someone wants to take back control, that's great. Thank you. Supply chain. So we just heard about supply chain. I think this is, again, probably a really significant issue. We know that globally there's a real crunch on supply chains. Australia is very far away. How do we solve for this problem? If we just get stuck admiring the problem for too long, it's not going to get any better. So again, we need to be proactive, get in there, do the work. We're spending a lot of time speaking with suppliers around the world. I think our procurement manager, Katrina, who I was just speaking to earlier, said in the last few weeks she's met with about 54 offshore wind businesses, again, to re-engage after a big round of engagement we did in 2022, culminating in some of these guides so that we could showcase what is available here today, what do we need to leverage, what could we tweak to get there, and what is brand new coming in. So 2 years on, we're doing another round of engagement, both from a top-down global perspective and asking all of those questions, building those relationships, but also from the bottom up. Who are the local suppliers? Who are the big employers at the moment? Which companies are they using? And how can we use some of those companies or upskill them and introduce them to the global suppliers to try to localize as much as possible. And as challenging as it is, I think Australia does have a lot going for it in terms of an investment destination, and look forward to continued engagement with people working globally in this space. I think I'm out of time, so I might now hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. That's really great. We will move on to Hossein Al-Ghossaly from BMT, talking about some of the challenges from the perspective of BMT as an engineering but consulting group for the industry. Over to you, Hossein.
Thank you, Marcus. Hello, everyone. I'm Hossein Al-Ghossaly. I'm a principal offshore wind engineer at BMT, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that the industry has in offshore wind, and some of the speakers have already touched on some of those challenges. Don't seem to have control over the slides. Can someone please move to the next slide? Thank you. My background is in structural engineering and offshore structures, and I have over 16 years of industry and research experience, and I have worked on offshore wind projects in different countries in the APAC region in different stages of these projects, and hoping to bring in some of those experiences into Australia as well. Next slide, please. And shortly about BMT. BMT is a maritime-oriented international consulting company, and we support a few different areas, including offshore wind. And in offshore wind, we support environmental studies and field surveys, metocean studies, ports, transport and installation, logistics, marine structures, asset integrity monitoring, and also vessel design. For example, crew transfer vessels and also service and operation vessels. Next slide, please. Now, quickly talking about offshore wind in Australia, as you might be aware, Australia has committed to net zero emission by 2050. And as part of that has a target of 82% electricity generation from renewable sources, which includes offshore wind. And the federal government has announced 6 regions around Australia for developing offshore wind projects. Gippsland, as the other speakers have talked about it as well. The first of these zones have already granted 12 feasibility licenses to offshore wind developers, and Hunter has granted a preliminary feasibility license already. Southern Ocean in Victoria is also waiting for the successful applications to be announced, and some other regions such as Bass Strait and Indian Ocean are still waiting to be declared. Next slide, please. Now, talking about some of the challenges that the industry is facing, one of the key ones, and this is a message that we've heard in the other presentations as well, is about regulatory and policy certainty. At the moment, we have a few different regulations that are basically applicable and are being developed and refined. Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act, which provides the requirements for obtaining feasibility and commercial licenses, and there's also a guideline on this, which provides more details on the feasibility licenses. Then we have the offshore electricity infrastructure regulations, which complements the OEI Act by detailing the operational requirements. And at the same time, we've got the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act as well, which regulates the environmental aspects, but there are overlaps between these as well. Offshore infrastructure regulator under NOPSEMA is the regulator for offshore renewable energy projects and oversees compliance with safety and environmental management and infrastructure integrity standards. Now, having all of that, we clearly see that having a clear and consistent set of policies and regulatory frameworks would be really important to give the international investors and developers the certainty to basically invest in Australian offshore wind projects and make this industry move forward. And at the same time, having basically streamlined approval processes would also be very helpful. And an example of that is the offshore wind industry in Europe, which is advocating for implementation of new rules targeting expedited permitting processes for renewables, grids, and also other related infrastructure, which that includes tighter deadlines for the permitting processes as well. Next slide, please. Now, another challenge here is the grid connection, and as it's been commonly said in the industry, without the energy transition wouldn't happen without having the transmission, and strategic planning and investment in infrastructure is needed to support the connection and distribution of offshore wind energy. In Victoria, Vicgrid is assessing the preferred options, including Gippsland and potentially Portland as well, and is targeting for 2 gigawatts by 2030. Another key enabler for the offshore wind projects is ports, and others have also talked about this as well. We currently don't have any ports in Australia that are ready to support these larger scale offshore wind projects. And as you might be aware, Port of Hastings is identified to develop the Victorian Renewable Energy Terminal as the primary assembly port in Victoria, but was rejected by the federal government, and they need to resubmit with including the mitigations for the environmental impacts. Now, there is a bit of a disconnect between the state and federal government review processes, which can cause some challenges. Another aspect to consider is that these port upgrade projects by themselves are quite significant and massive projects and require long-term planning and investments, and they require federal and state government supports and collaboration as well. And also to consider that there will be several offshore wind projects happening almost around the same time, and they would require multiple ports to support these projects, and a multi-state type of approach with ports in Victoria, Tasmania, and also New South Wales supporting these would be very helpful for the industry. Progress is being made, very important for the development of offshore wind industry. Next slide, please. Another aspect is the financial support packages. In Victoria, we have the Implementation Statement 3, which talks about a contract for differences structure to mitigate market revenue risk in combination with additional payments to close the revenue cost gap. Auction parameters and indexation approach still needs to be designed, and timeline for this is for contract negotiations and award in 2026. Environmental impacts are obviously quite an important consideration, and other speakers have also talked about that as well. Obviously, we need comprehensive environmental assessments to mitigate the risks and effects of these projects, and cumulative impact assessments as well to be considered. One thing here is that governments are probably not sufficiently prescriptive, and leave it to developers to design some aspects of environmental study programs, which then can create this effect that initial projects could set the precedent for the future projects, which then may not be the ideal approach, and government leadership is very essential. Next slide, please. Some of the other items, supply chain, as it was talked about, and T&I vessels, offshore wind industry is truly an international industry, and we need support from and contribution from other more advanced markets and international companies. For example, wind turbine substructures, subsea cables, installation vessels, and so on. All of that need contribution from international companies. And looking at it from a global picture, with the large number of offshore wind projects that are being built and being developed in other regions such as Europe, in US, and also in Asia Pacific, that would put a high pressure on the supply chain and would mean that early planning would be crucial for these projects to move forward. And connected to that, soft local content requirements can really help to bring in the best experiences and capabilities into the Australian market, at least for the early stages of the development of these projects. Community and social acceptance, as I was talked about, very critical, effective, and early consultation with local communities can really help in identifying all the concerns and also addressing them and not having delays caused later on the projects. And another aspect is on obviously the design and construction considerations for the Australian projects, which could have their own unique aspects. For example, with the zones that have been declared and also will be declared, we have areas of deep waters, relatively deep waters, which would require either very heavy fixed foundations or floating as well. And both of that can cause certain challenges of its own. For example, floating offshore wind is in its early stages of commercialization in an international sense, and will have its own certain challenges. Also, we have certain seabed conditions around Australia with carbonate soils, which need to be carefully considered in the design and also installation as well. And also the metocean conditions that could be slightly that are different from other regions and would put certain limitations on the operation of vessels. Next slide, please. Speaking of all of the challenges,
I'm sorry, I'll just get you to wrap up if you can.
Last slide. Yeah, all of those challenges at the same time mean that there is great opportunities as well. Offshore wind is rapidly expanding globally. And there are opportunities for innovation, growth, and leadership. And this would create jobs, stimulate local economies, and position Australia as a key renewable energy country in the region. Innovation and collaboration, as mentioned by others as well, will be a key for making this happen in a massive industry in a short time frame. And Australia, as a final remark, has certainly the potential not only to meet its energy needs, but also to position itself as a global leader in offshore wind energy. All right, thank you for your attention, and back to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Hossein, for a very important and cogent presentation. I'd like now to welcome Dorothy Danker, one of our partners from Sintef in Norway, who's going to change gears a little bit and focus on some issues rating from Norway that may have some resonance for Australia. Over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much. May I ask Leslie to advance the next slide? Thanks. Great. So good morning from Norway. It's a real pleasure to be here today in the Blue Economy CRC webinar. Thanks to everyone in this great project. And it's a pleasure to participate with a status report from Norway. So before we go directly to Norway, I wanted to also give a little bit of an overview of offshore wind in Europe right now. So UK, of course, leading the charge in Europe with installed capacity and the number of turbines, almost 3,000 turbines now. And I point to the one little wind park that we have currently in Norway. That's the Hywind Tampen wind park that is supplying renewable energy, offshore wind energy to 3 of our oil and gas platforms. And that's a little bit of the irony of renewable energy in Norway. Right now, we're using it to fuel fossil fuels. So anyway, I'll get back to that narrative a little bit later. Next slide, please. The EU Green Deal is a really important policy document that is really pushing for offshore wind, and also this idea that it's for all of us. It's for all of us to keep our well-being on the planet, and the role of the EU government. Now, Norway is not part of the EU, but the different environmental directives and aspects, if you can please advance to the next slide, are really important also in Norwegian legislature. So Europe has this idea of goal for 400 gigawatts by 2050. Norway's goal is 30 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by 2040. Now, also the different geopolitical narratives here, of course, energy security in Europe is an issue after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the price of energy also connected to that, the war in Europe is also increasing. But as was mentioned before, the EU has a goal now to fast track the simplification of these procedures to really ramp up European renewable energy in regards to the global market. Also to be competitive with China is one aspect here. Please advance the slide. So I want to also bring up our collaboration with Norwegian fishers, because fishing industry and the offshore aquaculture is up and coming in Norway, but of course our salmon industry is semi-affected by the explosion, if you will, of the interest of offshore wind. And I want to say that it's really a myth that goes around that fishers are against offshore wind. In Norway, fishers want to engage, but they want to be seen as a legitimate partner here and engage early and often with developers. And I'm very glad that this has been mentioned by almost every single previous presenter, that also in Australia, that this engagement is seen as very important. But one of the research questions that we have in Norway at SINTEF and with all of our colleagues is, how can relevant stakeholders bring information that we can use to really support coexistence? So this is kind of an underlying theme here. This picture I took also, these are the turbines, the Equinor turbines, floating turbines at Hywind Tampen as they're being towed out. And you can see a little bit of the size. There's a teeny tiny speck on that boat that's kind of tendering the turbine there, and that's a little person. So these are relatively big turbines right now in Norway. Advance the slide, please. So there's basically 4 laws for governing offshore wind in Norway, and you can see that these 4 laws are at the national level: the Energy Act, Offshore Energy Act, Petroleum Act, and the Human Rights Act. But also there's different scopes of this, if you will, multi-level governance. There's a global scope, but also a regional scope. And I mentioned the EU rules and the directives there. Please advance the slide. And this is a little bit of the process of how the process goes in Norway. So it's first the Norwegian Water Resources and Energy Directorate that identify these suitable areas and do the strategic impact assessment and open up the areas to auction. So we have just completed our first open auction. It was a reverse auction, so companies bidding on the lowest energy price that they could produce. And so we've just had a kind of a proof of concept that this whole cycle is working now. You can advance the slide, please. And I want to just mention that one of the aspects of Norwegian offshore wind governance that we think is the unique, perhaps, at least it's unique in Norway. We haven't done things before that has been such a multi-sector engagement. So here you see Annette Ødegaard, and I think she has shown excellent leadership in Norway as a bureaucrat that has gotten together the environmental agency, the fisheries directorate, the petroleum directorate, and the defense estates agency, and all these in a directorate group that has, if you would advance the slide, please, has done the assessment of these 20 areas that they recommend be the starting points of opening for floating offshore wind. So almost all of these are floating offshore wind because we're getting into depths of over or between 100 and 200 meters deep. So these areas, these polygons that you see, have been assessed in an 18-month process across government agencies, including the Fisheries Directorate and with fishermen, to say that these are the areas of lowest conflict across the different sectors. So these are the areas of the starting point, basically. And this has been, was first assessed in 2010 and now updated last year. Please advance. And I have basically these 3 take-home messages from Norway, and then I want to give an example of the new build that is about to start. So as mentioned, offshore wind needs stakeholder engagement, and I think a very, very important aspect of stakeholder engagement is data sharing. We can't build trust, we can't really build collaboration unless we're looking at the same data together. If everybody is bringing different conflicting data, different environmental things in that, it could be a bit of a mess. So we like to look at the same maps, we like to look at the same data together, and we can do that with good sharing processes. Next slide, please. And then we also are very excited at SINTEF because we really believe in technology and a better society, and technology needs data, and we need to monitor the ocean much more than we're doing. And the idea that floating offshore wind, because of the area and all these different turbines, I mean, we have tens of thousands of turbines in Europe. There's going to be turbines all along the coast of Norway. That's the goal, that we can use those to be extra eyes and ears out to the ocean. Also to, you know, the element of discovery, of seeing how different fish react, how the migrating patterns, new species, invasive species, that we are in places of the ocean we haven't been to before. It can be very exciting and also help the social license to operate. Next slide, please. And then this idea of trust also, and getting the narrative to be collective, that really showing time and time again how we are contributing to local goals, to the global goals, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. So we really have a big potential. I just got back from Estonia last night, where we went through all 169 targets of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN to identify which of those are important for aquaculture that could be rolled out at an offshore wind park. So getting that policy language right, for example, through the SDGs is one protocol that we have here at SINTEF and working on with industry. Please advance. And as I mentioned, we at SINTEF tried to, or are developing these tools that are also looking at the idea of environment and nature with social conflicts. So those who are very, very attuned to current events in Norway know that there is an onshore wind park that has been deemed unconstitutional to the Sami indigenous people's rights to reindeer herding. That's a huge social disaster in Norway, and the idea is that we don't want this to happen to offshore wind, so that in early stakeholder engagement being really important. Can you please advance the slide? And one way we work with stakeholders is, for example, participatory model building. And we have different projects from the EU and supported by the Research Council of Norway, where we're basically making the map together. And I have a stakeholder group of about 30 different stakeholders, and we've used these different workshops to say, okay, so how do we think these turbines are going to affect the environment? And also not just the natural environment, but also the social environment here. So we're in this validation stage where we're going through, we have this draft of some of the different drivers. And the idea here is we just got funding for a digital twin of the ocean that we can use locally for the new site that's going to be built out, Utsira Nord, where we're looking at these different drivers and getting kind of stakeholder information to put into these qualitative models that give us a good roadmap of how we want to dig deeper, qualify some of these drivers, and just so we don't miss any of that expert and local knowledge there. Please advance the slide.
Get up to wrap up, please.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. You can advance the slide one more time, because the next project in Norway is going to be this Goliath Wind project. And again, in Norway, this irony of offshore wind fueling fossil fuel energy extraction. So this is going to fuel the Goliath oil field in the Barents Sea. And now this is going to be from 300 to 400 meters deep. So this is another kind of proof of concept that even in the roughest Arctic conditions, that floating offshore wind could be a good idea. And this will start not in 2027, but it's scheduled now for 28. And that will be the next project built out, likely in Norway. I advance the slide, please. And thank you a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Dorothy, and hopefully have a good day from an early start. Thank you very much. What before I ask our last industries president to speak, there will be a report that SINTEF have written that will be available through the Blue Economy CRC once the final sort of sign-off from SINTEF has been done. And I urge you, we'll be on our website very soon. Thank you, Dorothy. Now I'll call on Alberto Galdas from SciTech to talk about SAF deployment in Australia, but also linking in with SciTech's connections to both Australia and Europe. Thanks, Alberto.
Thank you, Marcus. Let me see, because if I can. I cannot pass the slides, but maybe Leslie, can you move them for me, please?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Alberto Galdos, and I'm the General Manager of SciTech in Australia. First, thank you very much to the Blue Economy CRC for organizing this webinar. And today, I'm representing SciTech Offshore Technologies. SciTech Offshore Technologies is a spin-off of SciTech Engineering Group that started about 2016 for the development of an innovative solution for floating offshore wind named SAT, Swinging Around Twin Hull. For the past 10 years, we've been developing this technology in a step-by-step process from the early conceptual designs through several rounds of wave-time testing up to a full-scale demonstrator that is now operating in Spain for almost a year. So today we are happy and proud to say that we have a proven technology ready for commercial operations. The focus of the company now is the industrialization of the technology for the future generation of wind turbines in the order of 15 megawatts. As you can imagine, these are very, very large structures. Our team, with more than 40 professionals, specialized in all the disciplines involved in a floating wind project, provide consultancy services not necessarily related to our technology. Next one, Leslie, please. Yes, just a quick description of SAC technology. We defined it as a flexible, low carbon, low cost offshore wind floater that promotes local content. On this picture, you can see the geometry of the platform that is like a catamaran made of concrete with a plate underneath that provides additional stability against wave motion. Key strengths of the technology are the easy assembly and installation process, the single point mooring system that allows the platform to rotate and face the wind, and also the lower CO2 footprint when compared with equivalent steel solutions. And finally, the use of concrete as a local content enabler by mobilizing the civil construction supply chain. Next one, please. Sorry, Leslie. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So here there's a few data on the DemoSat project in Spain. It's a 2 megawatt wind turbine with a footprint of 64 times 30 meters. It is installed 2 miles off the coast in the north of Spain at water depth of 85 meters. It was commissioned in September 2023 and is grid connected. Our partners in this project were RWE and Kansai Electric Power, and we are really grateful for the contribution to the project. Can you put the next one, please? Yes, here is just some pictures showing the journey of DemoSat, from the construction of the floaters, the assembly process, the onshore turbine installation, the float off at port with a semi-sub vessel, towing to location, and the final plug and play and hookup operations. Next one, Leslie, please. Yes, here I think this is an interesting one for Australia, is the environmental research and monitoring campaign that is taking place now at DemoSat. So the mission of our environmental team is to deeply understand what's happening in a marine ecosystem when we place a very large floating structure. Based on that knowledge, we will be able to design and implement mitigation measures, but not only that, our team is working on innovative techniques to achieve positive impacts on biodiversity. Additionally, we're exploring other economic activities at offshore wind farms, such as aquaculture collocation. So out of the several ongoing projects, it is worth highlighting the DemoSat Lab that is being delivered in collaboration with RWE, where we are monitoring the bird and bat interactions with several sensors like DTBER, CCTV, and ultrasound recordings. We are monitoring the underwater noise and the cetacean detection with hydrophones, and we will be studying the evolution of the marine ecosystem biodiversity with systematic ROV inspection and metabarcoding or DNA testing. We have another very interesting project named Aquasat that is a multi-trophic aquaculture project within the platform. Next one, this slide, just very quickly, just want to mention the pre-commercial projects that SciTech is delivering in Spain, named Geroa at Medflow, in the order of 50 megawatt each, one in the north coast of Spain, the other in the Mediterranean coast of Catalonia. And we see these pre-commercial or projects as a good intermediate step between the demonstrator and the gigawatt scale projects. And we see similar projects happening in France, in Norway, we have seen some of them as well, and in other countries around the world. So next slide. Yes, thank you. And yeah, finally, so we get to the task demo project. This is the project that we are delivering as part of our involvement in the Blue Economy CRC. The project is supported by FIEM, it's a Spanish government agency, and our partners in the project are BMT and the University of Tasmania. The task demo project will evaluate the technical and economic feasibility of an early deployment of SAC technology in Australia, paving the way for future large-scale projects. Next slide. Yes, so the goal of this project is not to demonstrate the hydrodynamic performance of the floaters, because that has been already done in our project in Spain. I think the big question here is how could Australia, its people, and its ocean benefit from this floating wind demonstration pre-commercial project? We see 5 key points that I think are interesting. The first one is that a wide range of environmental research activities like the DemoSat Lab could be happening well before the gigawatt scale deployments. A project like this could help to advance community engagement and social acceptability towards offshore wind. I think concerns around visual impact or birth mortality or interaction with whales could be better communicated if the community has some devices in the water that they can feel and touch. A third one is testing the Australian supply chain and demonstrate local jobs creation, especially with our technology. We could make the concrete floaters in Australia. A fourth one could be the training of personnel for offshore wind operation and maintenance, taking advantage of existing oil and gas skills. And the fifth one, that is more a psychological one, but I think could be important for Australia, is encouragement during the waiting time and support developers on their journey to IFD of gigawatt scale projects. As we have discussed today, some of the required port upgrades especially may take many years, and I think smaller scale projects in the water in a short or medium time frame can bring a bit of light to the larger gigawatt scale projects. So next slide. Where are we now with the TASDEMO project? We've been going through a site selection process using a multi-criteria analysis in GIS, supported by our colleagues from BMT and UTAS, taking into consideration water depths, environmental constraints, meteorological conditions, and so on. And we have now selected 5 preferred areas for deployment, 2 in Tasmania, Stone Bay and Borneo, 2 in New South Wales, Illawarra and Hunter, and 1 in Victoria named Gippsland. The problem that we face here with the declared zones is that they are too far offshore for small scale projects to be economically feasible, because in the end, the cost of the subsea cable will be too expensive. So that's why we are now engaging with the key stakeholders in these areas to understand the technical, but also the regulatory framework feasibility of deploying a project near shore. We haven't had all the answers yet, so ideas from the audience are welcome. And finally, just a philosophical note from Heraclitus, I think in English, Heraclito in Spanish. Heraclitus was the philosopher of the flux. For him, everything in the universe is constantly changing. And I think this applies to the offshore wind industry in Australia, that not that long ago was totally unexpected. Thank you, and happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Alberto. Very interesting and useful presentation, and please put questions into the Q&A box for people. I'd now like to thank our industry presenters and for their perspectives, and now ask my colleague Martin Farley to give a short synthesis of the significance of the value chain before we go to the final section there. So over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Marcus. I guess thank you everyone for your participation in what we've done today. Leslie, I'll get you to give me the next slide if I can. Is that possible? Thank you. Thanks to all the partners, and also thanks to all those who've spoken today. It's been fantastic in terms of also creating a context for what we want to discuss very quickly now. Next slide, please, Leslie. Great. I guess what's come out of the discussion today, and everyone's spoken about it, but the idea of community acceptability policy and supply chains are really, really critical issues in their own right, but they're also really important and independent foundational elements of the development of our offshore wind production. So each element that we've spoken about today, I think the speakers have identified there are wide scope to multiple dimensions and implications, and they all range from local to national. So while we might have a national acceptability of offshore wind being a great response to climate change and energy independence and all the rest of it, we don't always have that emerging straight away at the local level. So we've got this issue about all these factors that have been identified today have multiple dimensions to them, and relate to our future as a country. So the challenge that we've actually got in place is how we productively connect them up in a way which optimizes short, medium and longer term return. So my background is I'm a microeconomist, and I think about how things work and how they might better work. But I've always thought about them in terms of originally, say, the triple bottom line, environment, economy and social, and UN social development goals, and most recently within the ESG framing. So to my mind, it's how we actually connect them up to do that stuff. So our core foundational challenge to some degree is in the framing, and how we then collaboratively and productively activate the system to adaptively manage the things that come up and hit us in the head that we've not been aware of or we weren't conscious of being an issue when we started the journey. So if we can look at the next slide, Leslie. Thanks. What we've done is taken a dynamic systems logic approach to this, and you saw that right at the start of the presentations when Danielle identified I guess the policy issues that were being talked about, and also in terms of some of the supply chain work that was talked about by Stephen and the others. So what we've done is we've created this particular approach, and it considers the offshore wind energy in a form which is akin to a jigsaw. As soon as I talk about dynamic systems logic, people's eyes glaze over, but they seem to find the idea of a jigsaw being an appropriate way to think of it. And the way we've approached it, actually, it's a special case where all the elements change shape and influence around a really key central tile, which defines how much energy by when. And what the speakers have spoken around today is that in some instances, we don't have it explicitly identified how much energy by when that we actually want to produce. But that's the initial target on which all other benefits revolve. Okay, what's the pathway from where we are now to getting that occurring in a particular time in a way that's actually viable for both the country and also provides those returns we talk to the investors and those that surround the whole system. Now, I'll bring it up in a second. I'll ask Leslie to bring it up now. But in a way, this, I guess, framework, the way we've represented the jigsaw, it actually is scalable, and it is able to be used. Thank you. Yep. Next one. Yeah, beautiful. It actually is able to be used at the national level, at an industry level, at an enterprise level, but also at an individual level. So each of us who are involved in this program today, in this webinar, we can also map our footprint on this. What's our contribution? What in fact is making it harder or easier for us to do the job that we do? And it actually thinks about this in program logic sense: inputs, output process in terms of a value chain, outcomes, and longer term impact. But it's framed by this idea of this is what our goal is, this is what our challenge is, pursuing a low carbon energy generation, and doing it in a way that not only provides low carbon energy to us, but also contributes to Australia's livability, well-being, and particularly our industry development in a world that's very, very sensitive to the resources that are actually used in terms of making all of their products. At the centre of it is the value chain. And so the way we've structured the value chain starts from locational selection, design, development, construction, improvement, infrastructure and logistics, how we make it, cabling, right through to this golden tile that I just talked about in terms of the connectivity, the production, operations, repair and maintenance. Because in some ways, some of these strategic goals that we've identified up here don't occur until this is actually in progress. But the issue is the longer that it takes is to do some of these earlier things, and the more that it costs us to do some of these things, it impacts on our return on investment and the way that we're going to deliver these steps in the value chain. Are in fact we're going to use local resources? Are we going to use the connections and skills and capabilities that we've got as a local community to do that?
Martin?
Yes.
Martin, I have to hold you to get you to wrap up. We're running out of time.
I will. Very quickly, the issue is that we've identified this with a particular value chain. And so the industry itself, though, doesn't operate in isolation. So if I can just have a quick look at the next slide, please, Leslie. What we've done in terms of how we actually think about how we create these benefits is the idea of offshore wind energy value chain, and we also have a model which has got the same architecture for a place. So how in fact does the value chain from offshore wind energy intersect a place's value chain? And one of the reasons we've used value chain is not just the technical elements of it, but it also relates to the way the community activates and utilizes that value chain. So this is the process we've been using and putting in place to not only synthesize what's been going on within the research process, but also to see how does the offshore wind energy intersect with place and that place experience. So next slide, please, Leslie. From our perspective, in the way we've designed it and thought about it, is the operability framing is really important. And it's used not only to create the diagram, etc., but to generate a clear narrative and basis for collaboration and joint activation. The issue is that we've got multiple disciplines and multiple views being applied to this process. Unless we have a framework where people can see where they fit and can actually understand their connections, the idea of being able to discuss and collaborate is challenging. And so a way of clarity in terms of cause effect relationships and consequences is central, but also coming back to some of the comments from the previous speakers, it also allows us to actually learn our way to the end goal. So thank you very much for that. And that's the process that we've used to try and start to bring it all together.
Thanks, Martin. Thank you. The Q&A will be starting to follow, but in fact, thank you to all the participants in this, and we're running out of time. I might get Leslie to put my camera on, please, while we're doing this. Right. Okay. Here we go. So thank you all for this. The Q&A. This was an ambitious task to do so much in an hour and 3/4 or so. Thank you to the presenters for answering the questions. There are a number. Before I wrap up, the questions remaining relate really significantly to a binding issue about how we actually going to pull this together in terms of local content, local manufacturing, local activity. I think that the answers actually in the presentations, there's both opportunity and ambition and challenge that's in there. And so I think that for those unanswered questions, we will address them in the second phase of this project for the next 18 months. Before we finish up, if any of the presenters have any last minute comments that they'd like to make in the no? Okay, I'd like to basically thank you, the first two presenters, but it's also note that the engagement of the participants and the fact that the discussion in the Q&A was quite significant and interesting and important, and we will harvest that and take it on board in terms of the work we've been done. There were some very insightful comments that were there about assessment rather than approval, the language we use, I think we'll now wrap up. The time is we're going to finish up. I'd like to again thank you all for your engagement with us. The recording will be available in the coming days on the CRC website, and I ask you to join in. I again reiterate the report that underpins the presentation from Dorothy will be available as soon as we can get some final sign-offs and things both ends. And then please keep engaged with the Blue Economy CRC website for the next webinar and for the next instalment of our work, which we'll be presenting in 6 months or so time. Thank you all, and we'll end the webinar here now, just on time. Thank you.